Tonight on First Tuesday.
She took my flannel off of me, which was soapy, and I just washed Joni's body with it. And she stuffed the flannel halfway into Joni's mouth and held it there.
As the care of the old goes private, we investigate a trail of abuse and neglect in what's become the granny business.
The local authority does not have the resources to effectively monitor, and also more than that, it just really does not have the guts, I think, to take on the proprietors of the private homes.
Good evening and welcome to a First Tuesday special report on a crisis in the care of old people. Over 7.5 million people in England and Wales are over the age of 65. And that figure gives some idea of the enormous strain that caring for the elderly has begun to impose on our society. At the same time, the government is closing down hospital provision for elderly people as part of a policy that believes old people are better cared for back in the community. Local authority services are not expanding fast enough to cope. And for those no longer able to be cared for at home, there are now fewer options available. Local authority homes are closing and people have no choice but to turn to the private sector. The result has been a mushrooming of private residential homes, into which the state is channeling about £500 million a year. It's a lucrative business for the homeowners. But what about the old people who have to live in these homes? What sort of deal is it for them in terms of comfort, of care, of the maintenance of basic human dignity? In this film, parts of which you may find disturbing, we've been investigating the reality of community care in the granny business.
Everyone has to grow old. These days, people are living longer. Not all of us can be cared for by our families. Many old people have no family. But hospital wards like this are becoming a thing of the past as the giant old psychiatric institutions are phased out. The aim, to care for the elderly in the world that they're used to. Community care. But as hospitals throughout Britain close, cut back or discourage long-stay patients, the state has provided few alternatives. The result, a huge boom in commercial private homes. As Britain's seaside resorts decline, hotels and guest houses turn to old people as a source of income. Unlike tourists, they don't disappear in the winter. The government is absolutely clear about old people's rights. Home Life, their guidelines on private care, says those who live in residential care should do so with dignity. Residents have a fundamental right to self-determination and individuality. The recent scandal at Nye Bevan Lodge in London shows these standards are not always met in local authority homes. Are private homes any better? The government is confident. Edwina Currie told Parliament this year, the vast majority of homes offer an excellent standard of care, often far higher than those of the local authorities which we are asking to supervise them. But could there be abuse or neglect in the mushrooming private sector? We have looked at just one county, Kent, where thousands of people retire to be near the coast. Many come from London. As the elderly grow old and frail, relatives are too far away or find it too hard to cope. Pensioners turn to the welfare services, and these days that often means private care homes. The number of people in these homes has trebled in the last decade. In Kent's private homes now, 6,000 old people, and the numbers still rising. The growth is rapidly spreading from the coast inland to cities like Canterbury. The Anglia is in Canterbury, registered for 12 residents, recently opened, together with a sister home down the road run by members of the same family.
They certainly don't like the old people. They've got no patience with them. They show no love, no care. All they're interested in is keeping that home looking spick and span in case visitors turn up. It's as clean as a new pin, but it's not a home. It's not a home for those ladies. It's an institution, and some are 97, 98.
There were old ladies there, like, for example, a lady there called Millie, and she was senile, and she was sitting in her room all day on her own, never had any knickers on or anything, just sitting on an Inco sheet, which is an incontinence sheet, on the chair with no knickers on, just a blanket round her. Sometimes I'd go in and she'd have other people's clothes on. I found her twice face down in her food where nobody had bothered with her. She wasn't washed, she was just left, and I think that's absolutely disgusting.
They're just an easy pound. And it's terrible to think that people like Millie Mears is being treated like a waif and stray, if you like, shut away in a room where she only sees somebody 3 times a day, meal times. We could go on shift and she'd be up to her armpits in urine. And she'd be literally smelling the room out. It'd be a horrible stench all the time.
I mean, what has she got in life? Absolutely nothing, not even the dignity of sitting there being clean.
The owners of the Anglia, Michael and Margaret Curran. Because of the danger of fire and medical emergency, Kent County Council have rules on any home with more than 10 residents. Registered for 12, the Currans have flouted the rules by employing just one member of staff on night duty. The Currans totally deny these allegations and say their home is often inspected by the council, who are satisfied with it.
The person that wants to open up a residential home should have to go on some sort of course, should be qualified, because these people just don't know what they're doing. They shouldn't be allowed to mess around with human lives the way that they do. It's just absolutely appalling.
Those people are in that home to be looked after. That's why they're in there. Because they can't take care of themselves. But they're not being taken care of by them. And I'd hate to end up in a place like it myself, truly. I'd rather die.
So when the boom began, how easy was it for people like the Currans to set up a home?
Well, any old Tom, Dick and Harry wanted to set up a home. There was suddenly a great deal of money to be made. You don't have to have any training. You didn't have to demonstrate that you knew anything about the needs of elderly people. It was a free-for-all, and it happened very quickly. Between 1983 and 1985, the number of private care places rose from 40,000 to 100,000. It was a staggering increase. Many of us thought that this was not a good policy decision to be taken so suddenly.
It's the responsibility of Kent Social Services to register and inspect the private care homes. They are legally obliged to do so under the Registered Homes Act 1984. They say they work in partnership with the homes. So what do they look for?
I think what we would seek to achieve as a registration authority is a quality of care which is similar to that which we try to provide in our own old people's homes, which is the maximum amount of independence and freedom and dignity that it's possible to achieve in a residential setting.
But is it just small homes like the Anglia which cut corners, or is neglect more widespread? There's a lot of money to be made out of old people. All residents with less than £3,000 have their fees paid by the DHSS, a basic of £130 per week per person. Pensioners who've had their own property have to sell up to pay their way. When that money runs out, they too have to rely on the state. Annual bill to the government for private care of the elderly, over £500 million in England alone, and the figure is rising all the time. The Hayley Hotel in Herne Bay is just one of a chain of homes run by the Todd family. They are among the biggest operators on the Kent coast. But not all the residents at the Hayley are old.
Young offenders and people from St Augustine's, a local mental institution. There's no segregation between the old and young, and very little between male and female. The elderly were subjected to awful conditions there, cramped into rooms, 2 or 3 to a room, young and old mixed together. The toilet facilities were awful. There's often no seats on the toilets, cockroaches and filth all over the place.
It must have been terrifying. It really must have been. To think that it could have been my granddad or grandmother in a place like that is awful. There was violence all around them. There was no hope for them to lead in old age a comfortable, secure life. All around them was pandemonium. Some of the younger patients were very violent and would go into a room and start fighting, picking almost randomly on people. And of course we always had maybe 1 or 2 who were experiencing a psychotic episode at that time, who really needed specialised care, which we couldn't give. We weren't nurses, we were just night assistants. We had no training in dealing with that sort of thing. And for the elderly people that were there, it must have been hell. It really must have been. Well, it was living in a madhouse.
Among those residents, an old woman who lived in an attic room writing letters to her friend.
The Hayley Hotel, Friday. My dear Betty, I don't know what I'm doing. My intelligence and general knowledge are nil. I get worse and worse each day, frightened to go to sleep at night, knowing I will be 10 times worse the next day. I cannot get out. I am too weak and lose my balance, so I am a prisoner in my attic. 'Tis filthy dirty here, very shabbily furnished, threadbare carpet everywhere. To crown all, I have bladder trouble. Water flows from me all the time, wetting the bed and my clothes, but nothing is done about it. I curse my social worker for bringing me to this dump. I hate the Hayley and I hate Herne Bay. Please write quickly, Betty. You might catch me before I go into a mental asylum. All my love, Eileen.
The violence wasn't confined to the residents. The Todd's son, Robert Todd Jr., assaulted a resident named Bob Campbell, who was shouting and being disruptive.
It appears that Robert Todd got up, walked over to him and hit him fairly and squarely in the mouth, knocked out 2 of his teeth, his 2 front teeth, bruised his face and gave the chap a real bad shock. The reason I know it happened exactly like that is, A, because they wrote it in the report book. He was cocky enough to have it written exactly as it happened, as if this was a reasonable thing to happen. I was very disturbed about it when I got there the next week and saw what had happened to Bob, and I actually stayed behind on the Monday morning and waited for Robert to come in and said, you know, don't you think this was a very bad way to react to somebody like that? After all, we're supposed to be caring for these people, not assaulting them. Is that what happened? And he said, yes, that's exactly what happened, the way it's described. And what's it got to do with you?
Staff complained that the Todds did everything as cheaply as possible, always finding ways of saving money.
It was my job to peel potatoes. On the Monday morning, I used to have to present the potato peelings to make sure that I hadn't peeled them too thinly. I used to think it was a joke about seeing the pattern of a plate through a piece of meat, but we could see that.
Robert Todd Sr. owns 2 other homes, Calcott Hall near Canterbury and the Wimbledon Hotel in Herne Bay. Both take old people, or they're registered only for the mentally disordered. Both are being enlarged to take more people. Total number of residents in the 3 homes already, 84. Annual income, at least £568,000. But for the Todds, even that doesn't seem enough. Extra illicit residents are crammed in.
Well, we knew the Hayley was registered for 40, but we knew from doing the job that there were more than 40. We were feeding 45, 46 people on occasions.
The premises next to it was being operated unofficially, illegally and secretly as a sleeping dormitory to fit more residents in who didn't officially exist, who were registered at other homes, in order that she could make more money on these. there was about 5 or 6 residents in the additional premises, which again isn't covered by any of the regulations because it doesn't officially exist.
Michael Griggs and Stuart Gillam complained to social services about the illicit dormitory and conditions at the Hayley.
We have actually made spot checks, as I say, where necessary, and we have found no evidence that there are, of a corroborated kind, that there are illicit people there.
Almost a year after that investigation, we returned to the Hayley. Is anybody living in the next door house at number 9?
What, there?
Mm.
Yes, there's all men in there. About 9 men. Yeah, but I just sleep there.
It's a sleeping dormitory.
Just sleep, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And they're residents.
Yes.
The Todds have also run a secret home just around the corner from where they live, in the quiet village of Highstead. Walnut Tree Farm was used till recently to house another 9 residents, many of them elderly. Here alone, estimated annual unofficial income over £60,000.
It was next to Mrs Todd's house, and the only way that people would get into this was through Mrs Todd's garden. The gates to the home itself were kept locked, and we were told that any visitors were to be referred to Mrs Todd. Because it was being run illegally, it observed none of the regulations which are there for the safety of the residents and for their well-being, including fire hazards and such like. So generally it was a very bad place for them. Among the abuses there was one of the elderly residents who was incontinent, was fined £5 every time he messed himself, still to go towards a cleaning cost.
As well as their large home near the Walnut Tree, the Todds now own a number of properties in the area. They also own a travel agency. The Todds company, Todds Hotels Limited, describes its business as residential accommodation for the handicapped. In 1986, total remunerations to its 2 directors, Jean and Robert Todd, £212,000.
She had no care for the residents. She wouldn't ask how they were. She knew perhaps a half a dozen of them by name. She wouldn't go and speak to them. She wouldn't ask how they were progressing. She just had no interest in them, apart from the fact that they were the people who brought her in the money.
Most of the money going to homes like the Todds comes out of the taxpayer's pocket. We attempted to interview Robert Todd Sr., in particular about his son's alleged assault on Bob Campbell. Is he prepared to talk to us or not?
No, he's too busy at the moment. He's on the telephone and he's rather busy.
So, can we have it quite clearly from you or from him that he doesn't wish to respond to any allegation made about violence?
I don't know anything about that.
Or could you perhaps ask him whether he wishes to comment on that before he tells us he's too busy to talk to us?
Okay, pass the message on.
We attempted to interview Robert Todd Sr. a second time.
He said no, he's busy.
So he doesn't want to make any comment to us at all?
Okay.
Right, you are.
Thank you.
The number of old people in Britain is set to keep rising well into the next century. As more and more of us get older, more and more of us need care. In Kent alone, there are 100,000 people over the age of 75. They pass in a steady stream through Kent's hospitals, some of them going on to live in the rapidly increasing number of private homes. While many of Kent's private homes have opened in the boom over the last 10 years, some have been caring for the elderly for a long time. Among them, the Pottertons Home for the Elderly in Faversham, the subject of complaints to the Kent medical officer as long ago as 1969. How close an eye have the authorities kept on it since then? 16 years later, in 1985, parts of the home appeared to be well run, but conditions for the most frail residents were another matter.
The first thing that really hit me was the dreadful smell. And it was confirmed in the morning when we went up to get the ladies up in the morning. I mean, the stench in the room was just absolutely disgusting. You really felt as if you had to take a deep breath before you went in there and not let it out till you come out of the room. It was absolutely dreadful. There was just one small, tatty sheet which couldn't be tucked in. And really, in the morning, we were peeling them off the polythene because they were so wet.
The mattress was absolutely soaked in urine. You really needed wellies to get them out of bed and change them. And then when it came to making the bed, you also had to take off the bottom sheet and wipe down the polythene and make the bed. And if the blankets, in fact, had got wet during the night as well, you just made the bed with the wet blankets on.
The blankets were disgusting. There was excrement all over the slippers. And the whole thing was just utterly appalling. I just couldn't believe my eyes that they could keep people like that.
Yet the council are quite clear about the standards they claim to enforce. In a directive to private homes, they say the residents should lead as normal a life as they are able, maintaining individuality and dignity and retaining their status as independent adults.
There was Alice, she couldn't walk on her own, and so she didn't try to crawl on the floor. You had to tie her into the commode.
How long were they tied up for?
Mainly all day. You fed them in the chair.
Tied up?
Sometimes I used to untie them.
And sometimes not?
Well, if it was me feeding them, I untied them. And then when I finished, tie them back on, because I knew she'd be coming up to have a look round.
Elderly women at the Pottertons were tied up on the instructions of Mavis Potterton, a trained nurse. It was on her orders they ate meals trapped on commodes by a pair of tights. One old woman was tied in by Mrs. Potterton herself.
She was put in on this commode. She was tied in with a stocking. Mrs. Pottington hit the lady on the hand with a slipper because she had wet the bed. The following day, her wrist was covered in a bruise. Her whole complete wrist was black, where she was bruised by the slipper.
The government guidelines issue a serious warning to those who care for the elderly. Physical restraint may constitute an assault and should be avoided except in the most urgent circumstances and in the interests of immediate safety. We asked Professor Murphy if there is ever justification for tying down elderly people.
No, none. Never. I know of no circumstances I can think of when that would ever be justified. It simply is not necessary with good nursing care.
It was Ted Potterton who often dressed the elderly women when they were woken up at 5:30 a.m. for breakfast.
This particular morning when I went back upstairs, as I looked down the corridor, he was frog marching one of the old ladies to the bathroom. He was standing behind her. She was completely naked and he had his hands across her breasts, which was just horrifying, just unbelievable. If he wanted to hold her under the arms, then there was no need. He could have gone round the waist. Or, no, his hands were clasped across her breast.
Another employee said, "I saw Mr. Potterton walking an old woman along with his hands on her breasts. I was absolutely disgusted. I thought, dirty old man." The Pottertons were eager cost-cutters. Some residents ate poorly and had to pay extra for toilet paper. There was often no heating at night, and everyone was forbidden to turn the upstairs lights on, despite danger to residents. Staff had to make do with torches. It was to prove fatal. One summer night, Gladys Page, aged 74, frail and confused, wandered from her bedroom and fell down the unlit stairs.
She was semi-conscious, and there was blood coming out from her ears. And we took her into this small room and propped her up and waited for the doctor to come. At first, Mrs. Potterton didn't want to call the doctor, but Mr. Potterton said it was for their sake that they must call him. They took her to hospital, and the following morning, about 4 hours later, I was told that she'd died.
At the inquest, Mrs. Potterton told the coroner that the lights upstairs were left off so as not to disturb the residents. Still no firm action was taken for another 9 months. Finally, Julia Landon alerted social services to conditions in the home, and full inspections were made, 16 years after the first complaint. Minutes of a meeting in 1985 between social workers and staff list some of the abuses they then found. The residents' alarm system that hadn't been working for over 5 years, deception of the authorities to disguise overcrowding, inadequate lighting, and the use of an unregistered room for residents. The Pottertons have now retired. We were unable to interview them, but their solicitors have passed to us a number of testimonials from doctors, relatives and former staff expressing satisfaction with their running of the home. The home is now in new hands. Kent Social Services have refused to comment, but did the authorities do enough after staff complained?
I think that those ladies should have been removed the same day, living in smelly, stinking conditions like that. If children had been found in rooms like that, they would have been removed the same day, I'm sure.
I think the sheer physical cruelty that was described on one or two occasions was very shocking. The thoughtless neglect of old people's wishes, the sheer insensitivity and total lack of awareness or training of the staff of what the needs are of those individuals. Those proprietors that were just cashing in, basically, on the social security funding possibilities.
In many parts of the country, hospitals for the elderly are closing, and Kent is no exception. In Thanet, a smaller number of health service beds in more modern surroundings have replaced the old hospitals. But once old people leave here, there are precious few local authority homes to house them. Kent's spending on support for the elderly, such as home helps, has been way below the national average. So private care homes moved in to fill the gap. The Grimston House Hotel appears to be a model of what private care should be like. Its owner, Douglas Pryke.
This is our latest home, and this is our reception area, and everything sort of revolves around here. Office here, intercom for all the rooms there, and we can also have an emergency system there, so if there's anything happens to anybody, we hear about it. Then through here, in this home, we've incorporated a bar, and in all our homes now we're going to do that. And let's face it, most people go to a bar in their younger days. Why shouldn't they have it as they get older? We've been open here about 3-4 weeks, and already the home is filled. No advertising, nothing at all. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Lovely morning. Yes. How are we all this morning? Fine. Yes. Lovely. As you can see, this is our lounge, and like most lounges, we've got a colour television and video and that sort of thing. And we have musical evenings. We've got a piano. We've got a couple of musicians here, which makes for a nice, happy family atmosphere. And this home actually comprises of about 21 residents. What it really is a hotel, you know, with a bit more care.
But even Douglas Pryke, National Vice Chairman of the Residential Care Homes Association, has serious concerns about the boom in homes so small they can escape registration.
There are 1,500 people at the present time in unregistered homes in Kent, and some of the standards in those homes are appalling. And there's no staff in there at times, and no staff on at night. You don't know what's going on. They could be getting food one day and not another. They're the homes that government should be doing something about. They're the homes that some action should be taken on, because what will happen is they'll be springing up all over the place, because they're doing very nicely, thank you. They've got no controls at all, fire officer, planning, nothing. They're the homes that that really government should be sorting out. And we feel as an association, and the National Association, very strongly about those homes. Something should be done, because people are being definitely abused in those homes.
Good morning, Social Services. Can I help you?
So while the councils have no legal responsibility for homes with less than 4 people, they do have the power to cancel the registration of larger homes. But on the rare occasions they do so, the effect can be minimal. Take 36 Victoria Park, Herne Bay. Nearly 3 years after losing its licence, still running as an old people's home. Owner, Paul Morton Thurtle. In December 1984, Kent Social Services withdrew his licence. They decided Morton Thurtle, a former builder, was not fit to run homes because of his consistent failure to cooperate with county officers' reasonable requests. He had failed to make necessary improvements to comply with fire safety and other rules. But what the council had not discovered was that Paul Morton Thurtle was really called Paul Charles Hammond. At Maidstone Assizes in 1966, he was convicted of housebreaking and larceny, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and possessing and carrying a sawn-off shotgun. Sentence, 9 years.
Did your checks reveal that this man has a criminal record?
I'm not going to comment on the individual cases. All I'm saying is that we will have made the normal checks.
Does it surprise you to know that the man whom you perhaps only know as Paul Morton Thurtle has a previous name of Paul Charles Hammond, under which he was sentenced to 9 years at Maidstone Assizes in July the 5th, 1966?
After 25 years in the public service, I've ceased to be surprised by anything, Mr. Harley.
1980. Morton Thurtle is tried at the Old Bailey for the murder of Frederick Sherwood, the owner of another old people's home in Herne Bay. Verdict, not guilty. January 1986. On trial for sexual assault on one of his staff at the home. Verdict, not guilty. March 1986. On trial for receiving stolen goods. Verdict, not guilty. The home at 36 Victoria Park is still running. Morton Thurtle appealed against the council decision to close him down. Nearly 3 years later, no date has been set for the appeal. The old people at the home have been kept in the dark about the council's decision and are unaware they're living in a home the council has been wanting to close for so long. Sarah Harmon represents one of the elderly residents and complained to the council about her treatment in the home.
It was a serious complaint about a woman who was elderly and very mentally confused, and there was concern about how her financial affairs were being dealt with, concern about whether she was receiving her pocket money, whether she was having baths. Very basic things, but very important things. And I was led by the local authority to believe that they were perfectly happy with the situation in that home. It was only some months later I found out that they were so unhappy that they were in fact cancelling the registration. I feel that they did my client a very great disservice indeed in not warning the client that really the situation in that home was not acceptable. Any person who has convictions for violence and dishonesty is not a fit person to run a home where the residents are vulnerable, elderly, mentally confused. It should be remembered that many of the people who go into these private homes are referred out of the local mental hospital. They're referred because they're supposed to be going into a caring community, and they find themselves in a home run by a crook, basically.
The Haven Rest Home, Gravesend. The only home that Kent County Council has actually closed under the new law. It has stood empty since July, when the council used its emergency powers to shut it down after the death of a woman. Residents were removed while police searched the property. The local hospital had told social services of their alarm, but this was only the latest in a stream of complaints over which the council had taken no firm action. 5 years earlier, the first complaint from a member of staff. And over the past year, doctors, staff and relatives have been expressing serious concern amid reports of urine-soaked sheets and overflowing commodes. But the local area manager told us we had no reason to go for a closure as there was no life-threatening situation.
In this particular case, we regularly monitored the home, we regularly visited the home.
How is it then that you failed to reveal the conditions that you then found when you actually closed it?
I don't think you can hammer us for actually taking action when we did
you can
on
if it
the
took
evidence.
you 5 years to take
not
it.
On the evidence that was available to us.
Professor Murphy takes a different view of the relationship between the local authorities and the private sector.
There is a kind of collusion goes on between the local authorities and the private sector. Working hand in hand is one way of looking at it, but colluding with poor practices is another way of saying it, in order to support these homes, because they relieve the local authorities and the health authorities of a lot of extra people who would otherwise be a burden to them.
But it's about this home, Annesley House in Margate, run by Mrs. Susan Newington, that we have received the most complaints. Old people are sent here direct from local hospitals, yet here the basic rights demanded by Kent Social Services seem to be singularly absent. Visiting is limited and telephone calls not allowed. Clothing is often communal and mail intercepted. Catherine Scott spent just 3 weeks at Mrs. Newington's. What did her son think of the place?
Reminds me of the visiting rooms in a prison. Gloss paint, blinking bare, really cold, an overwhelming stench of urine. Oh, terrible. And I cringe to think that my poor old mum was there for 3 weeks.
She was so cold and miserable, and that 3 weeks must have seemed an eternity to her. They really must. God, I wished I could have kept her at home. I would have done if I'd have known.
When she came out, she was much, much worse than when she went in. And we just had to look after her virtually 24 hours a day after that, until my mother went into a coma and died peacefully, happily, I say, in my house and not in that filthy hole.
First cause of death, acute bronchopneumonia.
To be able to have a little bit of freedom, warmth, have a decent something in your belly, keep you blinking warm. If they want a little sip of whiskey now and again, why not? If they want a puff of a cigarette now and again, why not? They're not allowed that up there. They're worse off up there than being in blinking prison. She runs that place the way she wants, behind closed doors. Nobody really knows what goes on. Nobody.
One person who does know, Sidney Radford, 82, decorated for wartime service as a fireman. He'd only spent a few weeks at Mrs. Newington's with his wife before they grew desperate to leave. He wandered the streets in distress, looking for a new home. Finally, he arrived here, where they now stay, at another private home a few blocks away from Mrs. Newington's.
The doorbell rang, and I opened the door, and I saw this little grey-haired old man standing there. He said he was looking for accommodation. He said if you couldn't get a room, he'd have to sleep out, because he could not go back to this place. Could not tolerate it. And not only for him, but for his wife as well, who was in very poor health. And he was more concerned for her than he was for himself. I showed him the room and I said, well, this is what we've got to offer. It's nothing out of this world, but it's nice and comfortable. And he was over the moon with it. He couldn't believe that there was carpet on the floor and a wardrobe and a dressing table each for him and his wife. He sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands, and he absolutely broke his heart. And it upset me, to be quite honest. He cried, and I tried to comfort him, but it seemed as though it all had to come out. He'd been holding this in for so long.
Sidney's second wife, Jessie, had fallen ill soon after their marriage. Without even telling him, the health authorities sent her direct to Mrs. Newington's. Devoted, Sidney insisted on going with her.
They simply sent her there and then told me afterwards. So I was advised by her sister and brother-in-law to set up and go with her, which I did. It was cold, very, very cold, and quite smelly. People used to mess themselves, wet themselves. People were tied in chairs for hours. There was one woman there, she wasn't all that old. She was in there, to my knowledge, one time, about 3 hours, calling for the toilet. And she was tied in a chair by a pair of tights. Men have been tied in chairs. roughly handled. On one occasion, I saw one woman dragged by Mrs. Newington up and down the corridor about half a dozen times. She says, yes, you can walk, you're going to walk. And drag her up, screaming up and down the back corridor. I think actually being in that place broke me, or near enough broke me, and I've not recovered from it.
Sidney Radford made a full statement to social services about the home.
In that particular home, we have found no evidence of inadequate heating. We've found no evidence of the overcrowding that you've mentioned, and we've certainly found no evidence of maltreatment of people. You must remember that that is a home which is looking after some residents who, in the jargon, are described as elderly mentally infirm. And the elderly mentally infirm are quite a difficult group of people to care for.
We spoke to a number of former staff about conditions in the home.
It was really smelt terrible. There was urine everywhere, on the bedroom floors, on the walls. There was feces all on the walls, in the sinks. The toilets were absolutely disgusting. There was 2 toilets to share between 48 people. No toilet seat on the toilet upstairs. They used to use a commode sort of through the daytime. The men and women used to get undressed all in the same room.
Most of them were in bed by the time I got there, which was 8 o'clock. Then I had to put them to bed, but then they were woken up again at 2:30 in the morning because we were so understaffed. There was 2 nurses to 45 patients, and we were so understaffed that we had to get them up at that hour. These were called the babies who got up at 2:30, and they suffer from senile dementia. They were on the 1st floor. Then we went up to the schizophrenic floor, and we got them up about 4:30. They had an illegal cup of tea that we managed to give to them. We weren't authorised to give them tea, but because it was a morning and we have got a little bit of compassion ourselves, we made them tea. But otherwise, the babies would have had to wait 6 hours for their first cup of tea or breakfast after having been got up.
They used to be fitted with catheters, and they used to walk through my kitchen with the bag, you know, the urine bag, trailing behind them on the floor, because the kitchen was the only way out to the outside, you know, the back door. They used to cry. I mean, they used to cry to me in the kitchen, and I used to have to try and say, oh, it's not as bad as that, you know. But it was.
Some of Mrs. Newington's residents by day.
3 on 2 into the basket. No, indeed, but
Nobody's going there. We've got all
not surprisingly, much as United have stayed in the zone defence, that Kings already having trouble in scoring against them. Well, Dan Davis is on court now, of course, and that may well make a difference, as that shows.
Hunched in his chair, little Walter.
Little Walter is an ex-RAF pilot. He was very intelligent. I never thought for one moment that he was insane, and I certainly didn't think he ought to be there. He had a problem with communication because he was partially deaf, but that was his only problem. He had had a stroke, and his arm was like this, and his fist was clenched.
He couldn't bend his fingers at all, so she used to grab his fingers and pull them out as far as she could, which was excruciatingly painful. It used to make him cry.
My first day I was there, I went upstairs because I heard a lot of screaming and shouting, and I wanted to find out what was going on. It was then I saw that the matron, Mrs. Newington, and another nurse there were both sitting on Walter and had his arm pulled right back. Now, to have your arm pulled back when you've had a stroke is extremely painful, and the noises he was making just horrified me. And I was expected to go and help, pull his arm back and try and push some drugs down his throat. He was screaming, it was blood curdling, it just made me want to be sick. It was awful. I saw this treatment of him happen practically every time I was there. If Mrs. Newington was about, you can well assure yourself that he was in some sort of pain.
Mrs. Susan Newington, state-enrolled nurse, graduated in 1966. Her father was a local councillor. She took over the home from her parents after she qualified. But despite her nurse's training, Mrs. Newington has often made her staff apply inappropriate forms of treatment to residents suffering from gangrenous sores. Ivy Solly, one of the worst cases of gangrene. Suffering from swelling in the legs, she was made to spend a hot summer's day locked out in the garden.
She got really big blisters down her legs, big water blisters hanging off. And the following day, Mrs. Newington says, "Oh, I'll have to get rid of that fluid off there," she said. So she got a scalpel and she cut where these blisters were. Then she bandaged them up. Well, with the intense heat and the filth in that place, she got gangrene in her legs. And there was blue bottles going in the bandages and God knows what.
We then had to put talcum powder onto her hands and pat it onto the infected area. She asked us to treat the gangrene with a 1-point icing sugar. She just brought some icing sugar up. As soon as you add talcum powder, flour, icing sugar to water, it turns into a mush. It looked exactly the same as the gangrene, and in fact, it probably made it a lot worse.
Little Joni was punished by Mrs. Newington for taking a piece of cake.
She got hold of her, she shook her, she threw her into a chair. She ordered one of the nurses to go up and get some rope and some stockings to tie Joni up with. Joni was a very small woman, very hard to handle, very, very lively, very strong as well. She was pushed into the chair and tied up across here, over her shoulders. The thing is, she kept slipping out, she kept slipping down the chair like that, but very fastly, and the rope would eventually get caught around her neck, and she'd be screaming. Mrs. Newington was standing behind the chair, and she would grab Joni by the shoulders, and she'd literally yank her back up again. This went on for some time.
For Joni, this was not an isolated incident.
Mrs. Newington came in, she grabbed her by the back of the hair, she was shaking her, "Have the nightdress on," she was shouting. She took my flannel off of me, which was soapy, and I just washed Joni's body with it. And she stuffed the flannel halfway into Joni's mouth and held it there. And Joni was just screaming. The next day, I was on the early shift, and I came into work, and she had several scratch marks on her face where the flannel had been pushed in so hard.
The government guidelines on private care clearly forbid the use of drugs to restrain people. Only doctors are allowed to use restraint by sedation, yet this too is a common practice of Mrs. Newington. To use these drugs on male patients, Mrs. Newington employs her own particular technique.
Then when you've got a man sort of really aggravated, she then has to get either syrup Largactil or pills Largactil down, in which obviously they're fighting with both hands, they don't want it. So she waits till their back's turned, and then she grabs them between her legs at the testicles, twists it, and then makes them go down to the floor. And while they're screaming on the floor, she pokes the pills or the liquid in.
I went downstairs, and Annie, one of the patients, had Mrs. Newington's arm bent back, and she asked me to stop it, asked to get Annie off. Mrs. Newington got her arm away. She then forced Annie to the floor, told one of the new nurses to get the bottle of Largactil and a syringe. She then proceeded to syringe large quantities of Largactil into her mouth, which Annie was spitting out everywhere. She then ordered me to take Annie's teeth out, just in case she bit, and just carried on syringing Largactil into her mouth.
The side effects of Largactil, which is a marvellous drug sometimes for some rare conditions. It can be helpful in small doses. The way it was being used in those homes is totally without justification.
And in one incident, it seemed to be just being squirted into an old lady's mouth while she was held down.
Yes. I mean, there can be no justification for that, ever.
Annie started to kick Mrs. Newington and caught her in the groin. She then ordered me to hold Annie's legs down, and she punched Annie in the face, and the next day she had a black eye.
Elderly people, on the whole, don't like having their lives disrupted. They tend not to want a great deal of change.
But elderly people need protection through you.
Well, we try to offer that protection, and I don't think there is any evidence that we fail.
We found numerous people who've worked for this home who make extensive and very telling and serious allegations about this home, all of which are consistent with each other, and yet you seem not to have heard these.
I didn't say we hadn't heard them. I said that where we have had particular allegations, and there have been some allegations about that particular home, we have investigated them, and the allegations have not been found to be corroborated.
Concerning Mrs. Newington, total number of witnesses we interviewed, 21. Number of allegations of ill treatment, 53. Her estimated annual income from Annesley House, almost £250,000.
The local authority does not have the resources to effectively monitor, and also more than that, it just really does not have the guts, I think, to take on the proprietors of the private homes. It doesn't have the will. And there are many social workers who are privately very concerned about the situation, but really there's very little they can do. There are no effective channels for them to complain about, so that all they can do is sit tight and keep quiet.
There are, what, 6,000 places in Kent? There are 150,000 across the country. You only have to think if you went to another borough, another county, you'd find exactly the same. I have no doubt you'd see the same pattern of poor quality care in most other places. There's nothing special about Kent.
We'd like to point out that we were unable to interview Mrs. Susan Newington of Beresford Gardens. Today, all the evidence in our film has been sent to the Chief Constable of Kent for his urgent consideration. After the break, we'll be talking to Tony Newton, Minister of Health, and Harriet Harman, the Shadow Health Minister, about the issues raised in that disturbing film. Welcome back. Well, in our London studio now, we've got Harriet Harman and Tony Newton. And Tony Newton, if I could turn to you first. Our film reveals a regime in some private residential homes which would allow, for instance, for no personal interest in the residents, for a careless attitude towards their comfort and their cleanliness, which goes as far sometimes as to tie them down physically, to abuse them physically, to administer sedation by force and without medical supervision. Does it cause you concern that perhaps the wrong people are running some of these homes and running them for the wrong reasons?
It certainly causes me very great concern when allegations of this kind are made, whether about private homes or indeed about homes run by local authorities. As you indicated at the beginning of your film, there have been some fairly serious allegations about local authority homes as well. Wherever that sort of problem arises, then I obviously want it tackled.
Well, perhaps we could talk to you about some of the incidents that were raised in the film. For instance, the incidents at Annesley House in Margate, run by Mrs. Susan Newington, about which we heard 53 separate allegations. Both Sidney Radford, who was a former resident, and one of the nursing assistants there at night, and Mrs. Newington, saw people who were left in their own urine and faeces. 2 aides saw a man called Little Walter, whose hand and arm had been affected by a stroke, being pulled and having his hand and his arm forced back by Mrs. Newington. Does that worry you?
Of course it does. I mean, clearly, I have seen the allegations on your programme, and no doubt they have been reported to the Kent Social Services Department as well. I can't make a judgment simply on the basis of your film. Some of it might even be said to involve criminal suggestions, and it wouldn't be for me, as it were, to prejudge the outcome of any investigations. But I certainly think that what you've shown on your programme and the reports you've had needs very careful investigation, and I know that Kent Social Services Department will give it just that.
But they've been told, and they've been told on a number of occasions, and yet the pattern of complaints emerges yet again, like Millie Mares at the Anglian Canterbury, run by Michael and Margaret Curran. I mean, 2 witnesses there to say that she was regularly left sitting in her room all day up to her armpits in urine.
Well, clearly I would not defend any position as shown on your programme, the allegations that you have made. The difficulty I'm in is that I haven't heard, been given any opportunity to hear, as it were, the other side of the story and what those against whom you make allegations might say, and I can't therefore prejudge the case. What I say quite clearly is that those allegations need to be investigated. I've no doubt that Kent Social Services Department will do that, and indeed within the last week they have strengthened the arrangements for their system, which checks and inspects local authority homes with a more centralised and, as I would take it, better organised way of doing that. That, I think, is very important and very right as a response.
But can't you understand the public feeling a little bit concerned about this? When, for instance, in one particular case, complaints were lodged 16 years ago about one of the homes that we investigated.
Well,
and all the homes we investigated have been complained of to Kent Social Services, and yet there seems to be a great slowness in doing anything about incidents of which we could find corroborative evidence without any great difficulty.
Yeah. Well, perhaps there's some conflict here, in that my understanding is that some of these allegations haven't hitherto been made to Kent Social Services, but that's no doubt a point that can be checked. I wouldn't want anybody to be mistaken about my attitude at all. I am very strongly in favour of improved arrangements for registering and inspecting these homes, and indeed for checking on local authority and other homes as well. That is why you referred to 16 years ago, but it is of course precisely because of the concerns in this field that we passed legislation to introduce new registration and inspection arrangements only about 2 years ago. They came into force less than 2 years ago. They are, I believe, beginning to have a significant effect, and a considerable number of homes have been deregistered as a result. Many others have had registration refused.
But isn't one of the problems that the monitoring, that the inspections take place in a situation where the homes are told that indeed the local authorities will be calling, as was quite clear from our film?
Yes, I think there can be problems in this field and in others with such registration and inspection systems. There's nothing particularly new about that. And that's one reason why we've asked the Social Services Inspectorate, our own Social Services Inspectorate, to conduct a study of the way in which local authorities are operating the new system, which came into effect, as I say, only about 2 years ago. I expect to have their report very shortly, and we shall be actively considering whether there are ways in which we can improve it further. There's been no complacency here. It is a difficult problem, but we're going on trying to tackle it in every possible way.
Harriet Harman, you've been concerned for some time about the developing nature of care for the elderly. Do you have any great confidence in the new inspection system that Mr. Newton talks about, or indeed the report into it?
Well, unfortunately, the local authorities themselves have said many, many months ago that they simply can't deal with the inspection in the huge mushrooming increase in private residential care. And it's wrong for the Minister to say he will look at it when the local authorities, who are the inspectors, make their response. They've been crying out for more inspectors to inspect, and yet they've been told to cut back. Now, many people that we saw in the film actually should have been better off at home if they'd have had that choice. But the government is telling local authorities to cut back on social services, which means at a time of growing demand for home helps and home care assistance, local authorities are not able to respond to that need. Or people who might be able to be in sheltered housing in their own homes, but with a warden. And the government again is telling local authorities to cut back on their house building programme. What the government is, however, doing is giving an open-ended opportunity for for the private residential sector to take anybody over a retirement age who's got less than £3,000, and then there is an open-ended commitment from the public purse. And I think that what we should see is more care in people's homes, then more sheltered housing, and the local authorities being able to provide enough and good high-quality residential care so that people don't necessarily, unless they want to, have to resort to the private sector, where, after all, the people who are running those homes are doing it in order to make a profit out of it. And in America, we've seen where the system has developed even further. You've got big business who are more concerned about their shareholders than about the elderly people in their care. And I'm afraid there they call it granny farming.
Well, Tony Newton, isn't there a point there that the funding system as it's arranged makes it more attractive for the local authorities to let private operators run these homes? After all, they're funded by the DHSS, and that in fact the whole point of the policy, which was to bring people away from institutions and back into the community, is being defeated.
Well, I think part of the point of the policy, and I think some of the remarks that have been made about care at home really hardly relate to the circumstances of some of those cases that you have shown on your film. The point of the policy, I think, was to try to enlarge the range of choice available to elderly people about the ways in which they should be cared for, and not simply, as it were, to be assigned by a local authority to a particular local authority home, but to have a somewhat wider range of provision. And I think that has been generally welcomed.
Right.
Now, the fact, perhaps I might just add this, it is very important that any system, whether it is local authority homes, where there have also been problems, or private sector homes of the kind shown on your film, or voluntary homes run by charitable bodies, should be properly checked and controlled, and that the standards should be maintained. Now, that is what we have been seeking to do.
Right, just to turn back then to Harriet Harman. Harriet Harman, when you hear about incidents, for instance, like the man Paul Morton Thurtle, a man with serious convictions for larceny and for possessing firearms, who now has planning permission for a new geriatric home, even though his registration to run a home at Victoria Park in Herne Bay, Kent, was actually removed by the local authorities 3 years ago, and it's still open even because he's appealing against it. Does it worry you that the monitoring service doesn't manage to deal with situations like that?
If I was the minister, I'd be saying, firstly, that I would get the Director of Public Prosecutions in to investigate the very serious allegations on the film of criminal offences. And secondly, I'd be saying to Kent Social Services, what do you need by way of extra officers in order to inspect the huge increase in private residential homes? I'd also be saying to Kent Social Services and to the people who live in the area, do you have enough domiciliary care so that you can make sure that everybody who could live independent in their home is able to do so, and that they're not stampeded into private institutions?
Right, and a final word from Tony Newton. Edwina Curry said in Parliament this year that the standard of care in these homes was good, often better than in local authority homes. Is not the problem that we have no guarantee of that?
I think the standard of care in many of these homes is very good, and when you look at some of the allegations that have been made, indeed some of the reports that we've had on local authority homes, some private homes are certainly better than some local authority homes. But I don't want to get bogged down in that argument. The point is that the improved system that we introduced for registering and inspecting homes may well need further improvement. That is why we've asked for a study into its early 2 years of operation. That is certainly why I shall be asking Kent Social Services for a report on their findings on the allegations made in your film. We want to see these homes well run, but we don't believe it's an answer to cut off the choice that the different types of homes offer to many elderly people in this country today.
And Tony Newton and Harriet Harman, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much. Well, that's all we've time for this evening. We'll be back with First Tuesday at our usual time next month. Until then, good night.